This is Christmas Eve and probably one of my very favorite services of the year. I know that we have many people here who are with members of the church, family, and friends. And so I want to welcome all of you to this service. I know on Christmas Eve that we have a lot of things on our mind: faith, family, friends, food that we're going to eat. I hope it's in that order. But regardless, those are the things that we think about during this time. You've always given me the wonderful gift of listening, and that is a gift. So what I want to do tonight, because of all the things that are on all of our minds, I want to do the sermon in a little different way. I got this idea from Fred Craddock when he was preaching a graduation service. Who's paying attention at graduation? All of the graduates and their families are thinking about, now we're finished, it's time to leave, where do we go? So what I want to do is I want to divide the sermon into 4 parts, and I want you to listen at the point where your last name falls. A through F. In Matthew 2, the shepherds are so prominent. Why the shepherds? I mean, these are people that were not able to even go to the synagogue or the temple because they were considered so dirty. All they had was to be in the fields watching over their sheep. And yet, it was the angel of God, the angels of God, that came to them and said, you are going to be the ones who lead the praise of this new Messiah that has broken into the world. They were afraid. How in the world do you do something like that when you're mere shepherds? And maybe some of the most powerful words that are ever said in the Bible were spoken to these shepherds. Do not be afraid. We all are afraid to some extent, but we're talking about fear that immobilizes us. Don't be afraid. You may not sing the praises in tune. You may not sing them the way that a trained chorale would sing them, but you're going to sing them with passion. And when it comes to praise, nothing more important than passion. G through M, the angels. The angels came to the shepherds and they said, God has chosen you to be the ones to give voice to the praise of this newborn Jesus. The angels are messengers of God. The angels are the ones that call us to do more than we can ever imagine that we could do, to be more than we can ever imagine that we could be. It is the presence of God in the messengers that gives you and me strength to do what it is that God has called us to do. The shepherds weren't leaders, but they knew their place with God. Jesus was the leader. Do not be afraid, because what I have called you to do, you can do with my presence and with my strength. Glory to God in the highest. N through S. And those who heard it were moved by what they heard, and some came to see what was going to take place in the stable. It really was a gift to Joseph and Mary and to Jesus to be in the stable. If they were in the inn, filled with the noises, the smells, people traveling, at least they had a place where they were by themselves. But people heard and they came. I don't know how many came, but they heard and they came. They tried to be quiet. A baby had been born. A mother was recovering from giving birth. A father overwhelmed by what was happening. They tried to be quiet, but you can't be quiet when you have children who've been traveling and they see other children and they start playing with each other. You can't be quiet because these people had come home to Bethlehem. Seeing somebody across the way. Do you know, I remember when you and I used to go to school in Bethlehem. Do you remember the good times we had? Do you remember the times that we played together? Do you remember Mrs. Smith, who is probably the hardest teacher that we had? And so in the stable, these people were sharing the greetings and the noise. What had been a quiet place was suddenly filled with people who were watching what God had done and were looking at a baby that was going to change the world. But they couldn't be quiet. Because when something like this happens and it draws all of us together, somehow we've got to give voice to what is central in our lives. Through Z, Mary and Joseph. Very little is said about Joseph. In fact, Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, says very little about himself, but we do know these things. He was a carpenter, but even more important than that, he was a righteous man. He was a Sadiq. When Mary was going to give birth, during the time in which they were engaged, he knew exactly what the law said and what the law said to do. You put away the woman. He at least was caring enough to put her away privately. In a dream, said to Joseph, take her as your wife, because Joseph, there is more God in Mary than you can ever imagine. Mary, pondering things in her heart. What was she pondering? There are moments in all of our lives when our faith becomes just busyness. And we fail to stop to ponder the source of our strength. We fail to ponder who it is that gives us life. In the midst of all that was happening, Mary pondered how her life was changed. In just a few minutes, we're going to observe the Lord's Supper. Do you know this is the only Sunday where we observe the birth and we remember the death of Jesus? The distance between his birth and his death are collapsed. And we will celebrate that Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples. This is my body, which is broken for you. This is my blood, which is given for you. I don't know anything that gives me more hope on this Christmas Eve. Jesus was born to die, but in his birth and in his death and in his resurrection, that's where we find hope.